As the colonies along the Atlantic coast took shape in the mid-18th century, they became grouped by region. The four regions, New England, Middle, Chesapeake, and Southern, shared a number of characteristics, including temperate climates and more than adequate average rainfall, which are critical factors for successful agricultural production. Despite these similarities, the colonies displayed many regional differences. The area known as New England was comprised of Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. This region was mostly English, with scatterings of Scotch-Irish in the population. With its proximity to the ocean, this area's major commodity was fish. Other important exports included whale products and timber. The major imports included sugar from the West Indies, wheat from the Chesapeake region, and manufactured items from Britain. The Middle or Mid-Atlantic colonies included New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. This region was known for being the most ethnically diverse, with large concentrations of Dutch, Scots, and Scotch-Irish, along with some Germans and a few Huguenots, or French Protestants. A large number of Africans and a handful of Swedes rounded out the population. In New York, slaves were required for the harvesting of wheat, which was a major export. Like New England, the Middle region relied on Britain for manufactured goods and on the West Indies for sugar imports. The Chesapeake region of Maryland and Virginia, also known as the Upper South, was the wealthiest of the eastern regions. A heavily English region, the area was also populated with Germans and Scotch-Irish. Overall, the Chesapeake population was 60% white and 40% black. Slaves were common on both large and small farms. Tobacco was the major crop of this region, although wheat became a popular crop, and both were exported to the West Indies. The Chesapeake imported manufactured goods from Britain and slaves from the West Indies and Africa. The final region along the eastern coast was the Southern colonies, or Lower South, which included North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. This region was the most racially diverse, with South Carolina being the only colony with a black majority. Mainly the English and Africans populated this region, with Scots, Scotch-Irish, Germans, and Huguenots figuring into the mix. Slaves were considered necessary in the Lower South as a labor source for the plantations, and were commonly seen on smaller family farms as well. In addition to tobacco, major exports included rice and indigo, while major imports included manufactured goods from Britain, slaves from the West Indies and Africa, and sugar and rum from the West Indies. Family and social life for all Anglo-American colonists were marked by certain common conditions. A pre-industrial economy put a premium on owning land. Knowledge of medicine was primitive by modern standards, and social hierarchy was shaped by the notion that God had ordained some to be rich and others poor. All white men and women were expected to marry, while women were expected to give birth, rear children, and manage the household. It was the husband's responsibility to participate in public life, including taking leadership roles in the church and government. While these characteristics shaped life throughout the colonies, there were regional differences, especially between the two most ethnically English regions, the Chesapeake and New England. The Chesapeake colonies were considered to have the more challenging environment, both physically and emotionally. Mortality rates in the Chesapeake were high, and most children had lost one or both parents before adolescence. Males outnumbered females, making it difficult for men to marry, although this ratio became more balanced by the 18th century. Those who did marry entered into a permanent union. Divorce was unimaginable, and separations were rare. Parents chose their children's spouses, usually putting an emphasis on power and property over love or compatibility. Necessity and the availability of materials dictated housing in the Chesapeake region. Homes in this area were generally built of wood. Homes on elite southern plantations were larger, usually 2 stories, and made from brick. Servants on family farms would sleep in lofts under the homeowner's roof, but slaves shared small wooden huts, segregated from the planter's home. In the South, food was considered a pleasure rather than just a means of sustenance. Herbs and spices were used liberally, particularly among the elite. Fowl, meat, and game were the standards, and Chesapeake colonists made vegetables a staple of their diet. Slaves subsisted on a diet made primarily of corn, often served as a thick gruel. Education was emphasized by the Chesapeake's gentry. Many were self-educated, studying classical literature, history, philosophy, and science. They hired tutors for their children and sent their sons to England to learn dancing and other arts of gentility. For the rest of the Chesapeake population, schools were few and far between. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts built charity schools. William and Mary, the only institution of higher learning in the colonial South, was chartered as a grammar school in 1693, and didn't function fully as a college until the 1720s. It was designed primarily to develop ministers, but did also offer non-theological subjects.
For as much as our well-beloved and faithful subjects, constituting the General Assembly of our colony of Virginia, have had it in their minds and have proposed to themselves, to the end that the Church of Virginia may be furnished with a seminary of ministers of the gospel, and that the youth may be piously educated in good letters and manners, and that the Christian faith may be propagated amongst the Western Indians, to the glory of Almighty God, to make, found, and establish a certain place of universal study, or perpetual college of divinity, philosophy, languages, and other good arts and sciences. Charter of William and Mary College, February 8, 1693.
Chesapeake families tended to live on isolated farmsteads or plantations, so the church was the primary outlet for socializing. Recreational activities, including dancing, card games, and gambling, took place in people's homes. Various forms of hunting competitions were common, but the premier event was the horse race, which everyone could watch, but on which only the gentry would bet. Life for New Englanders bore more differences than similarities to life in the Chesapeake region. 17th century New England offered a much lower mortality rate, with estimated lifespans of nearly 70 for men and over 60 for women. The average number of births in a family was 8, with 6 children surviving to adulthood. New England's Puritans considered marriage to be a civil covenant rather than a religious sacrament, and arranged marriages were highly uncommon. Unlike the Chesapeake, where divorce was unheard of, New England allowed divorce for such things as adultery, excessive cruelty, or desertion. Common New England houses were typically made of wood and often contained a hall with a great fireplace, a parlor where husband, wife, and perhaps the new baby slept, and a full kitchen, placed in the rear under the slanted roof. Under the homes were cellars for storage, salting, and dairying. Puritan tendencies toward minimalism carried over into food choices and preparation. The usual fare included fish, especially cod, porridge, baked beans, and brown bread. Baked goods were quite important to the diet, and baking was a common method of preparing food. New Englanders used mostly cornmeal and rye, reserving wheat for special occasions. They also consumed vegetables in season. The diet was quite nutritious, but aesthetically very plain.
For fish and fowl we have great abundance. Fresh cod in the summer is but coarse meat with us. Our bay is full of lobsters all the summer and affords a variety of other fish. All the springtime the earth sends forth naturally very good salad herbs. Here are grapes, white and red, and very sweet and strong also, strawberries, gooseberries, raspberries, etc. Governor Edward Winslow, 1621.
Education was particularly valued in New England, especially as a way to promote piety. New England made a greater commitment to public education and to the creation of colleges than any other region, resulting in the highest literacy rates throughout the colonies. In New England, as in the Chesapeake, learning took place first in the home, where children were taught basic skills such as reading and writing. Learning also occurred in the church, where the sermon was the principal device for teaching religious lessons. In 1647, Massachusetts decreed that towns with 50 families had to support a petty school, where young girls and boys would learn reading and ciphering, and towns with 100 a grammar school, which might teach Latin, Greek, and even Hebrew. Other New England colonies soon followed suit. Massachusetts chartered Harvard College in 1636, just 7 years after the colony itself was chartered, primarily to educate ministers. By the end of the 17th century, half of the graduates were taking other occupations. Connecticut chartered Yale in 1701 to fight off Harvard's perceived theological liberalism. The late colonial period witnessed the founding of the College of Rhode Island, renamed Brown, and Dartmouth, which was originally an Indian school. Recreation in New England differed greatly from recreation in the Chesapeake. Whereas the Chesapeake peoples loved competitions that demonstrated individual skills, New Englanders focused on team events, including the predecessors of football and baseball. Due to New England's strict religious principles, Sunday sports were forbidden, and games of chance, racing, and activities involving drinking were strongly discouraged. Certainly, New England's piety affected every aspect of its population's lives, prevailing in a kind of cultural austerity, while Chesapeake life took on a more festive, less inhibited cast. However, the festivity of the Chesapeake was tempered by the high mortality rates and expectations of loss, whereas New Englanders grew to expect a longer, healthier life.